Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis from my atheist perspective. In this video, we will be going through chapters 9 through 12 of the book, so let's get started right away with chapter 9. And we pick up where we left off at the end of the last video, at the end of chapter 8. Screwtape in this letter, which is chapter 9, is explaining to Wormwood how to effectively exploit the spiritual dry spell that the patient, the person they are attempting to woo away from God, is currently experiencing. If you remember at the end of the last chapter, they were talking about the fact that Wormwood's patient is currently in a bit of a trough in terms of his religious experience, his Christianity, and now Screwtape is going to give Wormwood some more tips on how to exploit that spiritual trough and to sort of try to keep him there. Well, firstly, Screwtape recommends sensual temptations. These have been effective on people living through a trough period in their relationship with God. While people have more energy and motivation during their peaks, people have less resistance during troughs. Plus, sexual temptation felt during a down period is less likely to lead to falling in love and more likely to lead to perversion. And feelings that lead to love and anything genuine and sincere, that's bad news for Screwtape and Wormwood for their purposes. But if it leads to perversion, then that's good for them. And sadly, Screwtape doesn't elaborate on what he means by perversion. Would C.S. Lewis's conception of the perverse strike us as mundane? Or would it be shockingly warped and explicit? Alas, we may never know. Sex isn't the only tool available. All temptations of the flesh can be exploited. Screwtape writes that Wormwood is much more likely to tempt his patient into becoming a drunkard now that he is in a spiritual trough than he would be if he encouraged him to drink during a happier time. Quote, "Never forget that when we are dealing with any pleasure in its healthy and normal and satisfying form, we are, in a sense, on the enemy's, meaning God's, ground. I know we have won many a soul through pleasure. All the same, it is His invention, not ours. He made the pleasures. All our research so far has not enabled us to produce one. All we can do is encourage the humans to take the pleasures which our enemy has produced at times or in ways or in degrees which he has forbidden." And this is Lewis's spin on something that you've probably heard an evangelical preacher say a time or two if you've paid much attention to that portion of Christianity over the years. God doesn't hate sex. God invented sex. The idea, as I take it, is to push back against the charge that Christians are all a bunch of puritanical and joyless and chaste buzzkills, that they hate sex, that they oppose all physical pleasure. Not so, they insist. As Lewis tells his readers through Screwtape, pleasure is God's invention. It's not the devil's. The only thing is, since God did invent it and all, he reserves the right to tell you how you should enjoy it. God's not telling you not to have sex. He's just telling you how to have it, and when, and with who, and for what reason. And that sneaky old devil wants you to believe that you own your sexuality. You control it, and you should get to choose when and where and how and with whom you explore and experience it. And that makes the devil the bad guy. But of course, there's another layer to this, because God doesn't tell anyone what the rules of sex are supposed to be, does he? It's priests who do that. Those officially recognized by a church and also self-appointed priests, like Lewis, people who claim to speak for God, who claim to know what God wants, and are just delivering the message for the rest of us. So, just remember, sex and other pleasures aren't bad. They're gifts from God. But you have to enjoy them strictly within God's established guidelines, or they can be used to woo you into the arms of the evil one, and then you'll burn in hell forever. Which, really, how much is a gift even worth if it doesn't come with an unfathomably dark and perilous downside? I mean, come on. You can drown in a swimming pool, right? That's what makes it nice. But the best way to exploit the patient's spiritual trough, Screwtape says, is not to get him to indulge in earthly pleasures. Instead, it's to convince him that this isn't a trough waiting for the ascent to another peak, but rather a permanent state of affairs. His life and his walk with God, his religious experience, however you want to describe it, it's just going to be like this from now on. If Wormwood can get him into that headspace, then they've got him. They can encourage him to view the trough as the natural state of his Christianity, get him to think that religion is all very well up to a point, as Screwtape suggests. Try to persuade him that his newfound religion and his newfound fervor in his religion, his passion for his religion, is just a phase, and it will pass away like his other phases have passed away. Screwtape writes that a moderated religion is as good for us as no religion at all. When he refers to moderated religion, I take Lewis to mean a religion compromised by other things, or a religion that is taken as just one facet among many equally important facets in one's life. I don't think he's saying that zealous fundamentalism is the only legitimate form of religion, although, if you'll recall in the previous video, we talked about how he apparently believes that extremism in favor of God is okay. The only form of extremism that is acceptable is extremism in devotion to God. But even with that in place, I don't think he's recommending religious extremism or religious zealotry here. He's saying that the only legitimate form of religion, and of course specifically the only legitimate form of Christianity, is something that you are committed to fully and is centered in your life and not placed alongside other things. You mustn't place God alongside other things in your life. God must be at the center and must consume all of you. In other words, your life must revolve around God and only God. God must be alone at the center of your life. And God tells us in the Old Testament that this is true. He says that he is a jealous God. Did we not think he meant that shit? C.S. Lewis obviously believed him. That's chapter 9. Let's move on now to chapter 10. Screwtape is pleased that Wormwood's patient has made some new friends recently, and he heard this from another demon, Triptweeze. You can tell that Lewis has some fun thinking up absurd names for the various demons in this story, which I can relate to. One of the best parts about writing science fiction or fantasy, because sometimes in the past I've written like sort of parody Star Trek comics to amuse myself, and occasionally I've posted them online. And the most fun part of those is often coming up with ridiculous sounding names for alien planets, and where you just smash together random syllables and you call that a name. Grill Trib Trax, that's a planet, sure. Seems like that's what Lewis is doing when he's naming his demons. Triptweeze. The new friends that the patient has made are a middle-aged married couple who Screwtape describes as rich, smart, superficially intellectual, and brightly skeptical about everything in the world. They are also pacifists, but not on moral grounds, rather because they look down on anything that concerns their fellow humans. Quote, "No doubt he must," meaning the patient, "he must very soon realize that his own faith is in direct opposition to the assumptions on which all the conversation of his new friends is based. He will be silent when he ought to speak, and laugh when he ought to be silent. He will assume, at first only by his manner, but presently by his words, all sorts of cynical and skeptical attitudes which are not really his, but if you play him well, they may become his. All mortals tend to turn into the thing they are pretending to be." And here's a good example of what effective tools irony and satire can be, and what a striking difference it is from what is typical for this series, this Atheist Reads series of mine, to see a writer who actually knows how to use these tools. Look at how Lewis is able to call out the cowardice and hypocrisy of his fellow Christians without saying anything directly. Screwtape writes in approval of how Wormwood's patient, a newly converted Christian, will hold his tongue around his new non-Christian friends, will keep quiet about his faith, will say and do things in order to please them, and will pretend to share their attitudes until eventually he's not pretending anymore. Their attitudes will become his. Is that the kind of Christian you want to be? Lewis is indirectly asking his readers. You want to be the kind of Christian who meets with the approval of a demon? Okay, so it's not exactly subtle, but compared to the sledgehammers employed by every other apologist I've ever read to get their points across, Lewis's technique here is practically subliminal. Moving on, Screwtape recommends that Wormwood try to keep his patient from realizing the temptation represented by his new friends. Ideally, he will only come to question their character when they're not around. As long as his friends are with him, their presence will, as Screwtape puts it, sweep away all criticism. Eventually, if Wormwood's labors are successful, the patient will begin to live as different people. He will actually be a different person, depending on who he is with at the time. Or, if this doesn't happen, then he will begin to enjoy the fact that his life is so inconsistent, that his time spent as a Christian and his time spent with his non-religious friends are so incongruous. Quote, "You see the idea. The worldly friends touch him on one side and his fellow Christians on the other, and he is the complete, balanced, complex man who sees round them all. Thus, while being permanently treacherous to at least two sets of people, he will feel, instead of shame, a continual undercurrent of self-satisfaction." Of course, there's only treachery involved here because Lewis has set up the situation so the worldly side and the churchy side are incompatible. If you're dedicated to the church, truly dedicated, you shouldn't be hanging out with those godless worldly people at all, unless you're there primarily as a representative of the church, presumably. Meanwhile, those judgmental, superior, worldly friends wouldn't understand or accept your Christianity, so if you want to hang out with them, you've got to hide it and pretend to be someone else. Or, and hear me out because I know this is a bizarre suggestion, maybe, if you want to, you can have church friends and non-church friends and be open about the fact that you go to church and that you also like to hang out with people who don't go to church sometimes, and as long as you're not a fucking jerk about it, nobody would really seem to mind. You don't need to operate under any false pretenses. And you don't need to be a self-satisfied ass who thinks they've got it all figured out either. You can just be a person who goes to church, but who doesn't need to have church consume their entire life and flavor their every human interaction and their every thought and deed. And you can also be someone who has friends outside church, but who doesn't feel the need to hide the fact that you go to church because, as previously suggested, you aren't a dick about it. It's an audacious proposal. I know, I realize that, but it just might work. If you even want to go to church in the first place, that is. Which, hey, go for it. If going to church is your thing, then do it. Personally, I cannot recommend it. But you do you. And be friends with whoever you want to be friends with. I mean, as long as they're not assholes. If you're not an asshole and your friends aren't assholes, then whether or not somebody's going to church or not shouldn't really be a problem, should it? Anyway, chapter 11. In this chapter, Screwtape seeks to clarify the subject of laughter for Wormwood. Screwtape is happy to learn that the patient's new friends are all, as he puts it, consistent scoffers and worldlings who are progressing quietly and comfortably towards our Father's house. Our Father, of course, being the devil, Satan. But he warns Wormwood that their being great laughers doesn't mean that laughter is always in their favor. Here we see one of the advantages of the epistolary format of the novel, where we're only reading Screwtape's letters. We're not reading Wormwood's letters, because it allows Lewis to make these sort of abrupt shifts in subject and focus in the narrative and have it feel like it belongs there, because we're meant to read this as Screwtape responding to Wormwood's letter. So, of course, Screwtape all of a sudden decides to start talking about laughter out of nowhere, apropos of nothing, because he's responding to something that Wormwood wrote in his previous unread by us letter. See that? See how writing works? Screwtape divides laughter into 4 categories according to what causes the laughter: joy, fun, the joke proper, and flippancy. Now, the first 2, joy and fun, are of little or no use to Screwtape and Wormwood. Joy is something that they, as minions of Satan, just don't understand at all. They don't get how it works, they don't get where it comes from, and they strongly dislike it. They're not big fans of joy. And fun is very much like joy. And it can also promote evils such as charity, courage, and contentment. And fun can bring people together. When you have fun with other people, you draw closer to them. And that's something else that Wormwood and Screwtape do not want to encourage the patient to have. But laughter in response to the joke proper holds more promise for them. Bawdy jokes are not as effective as one might think, because people who are given to lustful thoughts are unlikely to be moved in that way when sex is presented in a way that is funny. So if you're a demon trying to tempt your patient to the dark side, you might think, oh, get him to laugh at some smutty jokes, that'll do it. It might not be the best thing, according to Screwtape. The best way is actually to use humor to excuse and cover up feelings of shame. People, and Screwtape says the English in particular, use humor to mask their sins. Cruelty is shameful, he says, unless the cruel person can present it as a joke. Quote, 1,000 bawdy or even blasphemous jokes do not help towards a man's damnation so much as his discovery that almost anything he wants to do can be done, not only without the disapproval, but with the admiration of his fellows, if only it can get itself treated as a joke. Once again, I have this reaction that I rarely have to things written by apologists other than Lewis, which is, good point. Take out the language about damnation or interpret that in something other than a strictly religious context, and this is a very sharp observation to which we'd all do well to pay attention. Calling something a joke is not a defense. Something can be a joke and be recognized as such by others and still be legitimately regarded as offensive or cruel or harmful. Jokes are not immune to criticism, and people who tell jokes are not immune to the consequences of the jokes or of the things they call jokes, which they choose to tell. Jokes can make people laugh and make people think. They can be entirely silly and absurd. They can be gentle or biting. They can ride an undercurrent of social commentary or critique. But we shouldn't allow them to be used by cruel, ignorant, bigoted people to mask the cruelty, ignorance, and bigotry they're trying to propagate, or to be used as a defense for unwittingly propagating those things. Not C.S. Lewis's original point, but a good point, nonetheless, suggested by what he wrote, which is more than most other apologists I've read can say for themselves. Now, the best kind of laughter is that which is the result of flippancy, Screwtape says. That's because flippant people don't require an actual joke to be made, just the implication that a joke has taken place. Flippancy allows people to talk about virtue as if it were funny without having to go through the trouble of constructing an actual joke about it. So it's like those, superhero movie or date movie, those witless spoof movies that don't even have jokes. They just have references to things. It's like that. That's flippancy. A prolonged habit of flippancy can result in a person regarding every serious subject as having a ridiculous side to it. It pulls people further away from the dreaded feeling of joy. It dulls the intellect, and it doesn't inspire affection between those who practice it. So for the purposes of demons like Screwtape and Wormwood, it's the good kind of laugh. It's the kind of joyless laugh that moves people further apart from each other. Again, not a bad point if you extract the judgmental Christian proselytizing from it. I don't necessarily object to flippancy or irreverence, but if you allow them to take over your worldview and your personality to the extent that you're almost incapable of seriousness or sincerity, then that's a problem. And it's not a problem because it'll get you a one-way ticket to hell, as C.S. Lewis suggests. It's a problem because it'll make you a fucking jerk. And who wants to live in a world full of fucking jerks? A lot of us feel like we live there already. Is it fun? Now, chapter 12. Screwtape remarks on the excellent progress that Wormwood is making with his patient, but he cautions Wormwood to take care that the patient doesn't become aware of his true position. While they are fully aware of how they have begun to lead him away from God, or the enemy as they say, the patient must not be allowed to know this. He must be made to regard his recent moves in this direction as trivial and revocable. Because of this, it's a good thing that he is still going to church, despite his waning interest and his being in a trough. It's to their advantage that he continue to think of himself as a Christian, so that he doesn't truly recognize his sin and repent for it. The patient's vague sense of uneasiness is something they can use if it can be made to remain as it is and not flower into real repentance. Quote, "All humans at nearly all times have some such reluctance, but when thinking of Him, meaning God, involves facing and intensifying a whole vague cloud of half-conscious guilt, this reluctance is increased tenfold. They hate every idea that suggests Him, just as men in financial embarrassment hate the very sight of a passbook. In this state, your patient will not omit, but he will increasingly dislike his religious duties. He will think about them as little as he feels he decently can beforehand, and forget them as soon as possible when they are over. He will want his prayers to be unreal, for he will dread nothing so much as effective contact with the enemy." The suggestion here of another oft-used bit of apologist boilerplate: we deny God because we are convicted by our guilt. We don't want to face God and His judgment because we know we've sinned. We know that we're in for it, so we turn away from God. So, if you're a Christian and you find yourself losing the enthusiasm you once had for your faith, if your prayers are less sincere, if your participation in church is more and more grudging and perfunctory, it's not because you're beginning to realize that maybe you don't actually believe this stuff anymore, or because your church is no longer filling the role in your life you once needed it to fill. It's because you know deep down that you're a sinner and you're running away from that realization. And the answer is the same as it always is: turn around, run back to Jesus. Not specifically the way Lewis would have said it, I presume, but the more the patient becomes entrenched in this uneasy state of mind where he is reluctant to actually talk about God, the easier it will be for Wormwood to keep the patient away from God. Instead of having to tempt him away with other things that he really enjoys, he can be induced to do things he doesn't enjoy, or to do nothing at all, rather than do things that will bring him closer to God, because he won't want to do that no matter what. Screwtape reminds Wormwood that small sins are just as useful to them as the more spectacular ones, because their cumulative effect is to move the patient, as Screwtape puts it, away from the light and out into the nothing. Quote, "Murder is no better than cards if cards can do the trick. Indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts." Take the religion out, interpret it figuratively, and once again, it's a nice little bit of wisdom. How often have we heard that the road to hell is paved with good intentions? Lewis is trying to warn his Christian readers that even if they've never done anything outrageously awful, they can still be walking on the road to hell. Again, this is something we hear from apologists and evangelists all the time. A sin is a sin. A tiny sin will keep you out of heaven just the same as a big one. God is such a prick that even straight A's aren't good enough for Him. He needs you to have never, ever gotten a question wrong. One miss counts more than 1,000,000 hits. That's God's idea of justice. That's why you need Jesus. That's what Lewis is telling his audience. But you can also take what he's saying and realize, entirely apart from its religious message, that you can still do evil without meaning to do evil, and you can still do evil without ever doing a lot of evil at once. Just little, seemingly inconsequential bits here and there. Because we are what we do. And if we do wrong more often than we do right, even if it's just a little wrong at a time, that becomes who we are. Not the message C.S. Lewis is trying to send, not exactly, but not a bad one. And that's one of the nice things about literature and about art in general. We can take things away from it that the artist didn't even know were in there. And in this case, things that, due to its explicitly Christian message, the artist would probably be a little annoyed that we are taking from it. And that makes it all the better, for me anyway. I don't know about you. Well, that's it for chapter 12. That's it for this video. I will be back in the next video in this series to cover the next 4 chapters, those being chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16 of the book. If you have anything to say in response to anything I have had to say in this video, be you Christian or atheist or some other flavor of believer or non-believer, I invite you to leave a comment. Let me know what you're thinking. Tell me something I got right. Tell me something I got wrong. Agree with me, disagree, whatever you have to say in response to something I have had to say here, please do feel free to share it with me. Also, if you enjoyed this video, if you got something out of it, I invite and encourage you to like, share, subscribe to this channel if you're not subbed already. And also, please help me to continue producing videos like this and all of the other videos that I do on this channel by becoming a supporter through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron of this channel for as little as $1 a month, and those $1 a month pledges help me out tremendously. They also have a cumulative effect. But if you can afford it and you think I'm worth it and you pledge $5 a month or higher, you can take advantage of some extra little perks in the campaign, one of which is getting a sneak peek at scripts for the An Atheist Reads series, which I post the day before the videos go up. So just a little something extra to show my appreciation for folks who are able and willing to go a little bit above and beyond in their Patreon campaign support. So thanks to all of you for watching, and I'll see you next time.